Hello anatomists! The lab you're doing this week covers the human circulatory system, which will include both the heart and blood vessels. When you look at the heart, it functions as a double pump. You have the right side of the heart here depicted in blue that sends blood into the pulmonary circuit where it can pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide with the lungs. And then that blood, newly oxygenated, comes back to the left side of the heart. Then the left side of the heart pumps through the aorta and sends the blood through what's called the systemic circuit. So it sends it through all of the rest of your body, delivering that oxygen to your tissue cells and picking up carbon dioxide as it comes back up to the right side of the heart. So the circuit that delivers blood and brings blood back from the lungs is called the pulmonary circuit, and the circuit that delivers blood to the rest of your body and sends that blood back to the heart is called the systemic circuit. The systemic circuit the arteries will carry oxygenated blood, and the side that returns to the heart will carry more oxygen poor blood. When you're looking at the pulmonary circuit, the arteries will carry the oxygen poor blood, and the veins will carry oxygen rich blood. And you may be a little bit confused as to the terminology with the arteries and veins and what is oxygen rich and what is oxygen poor. Arteries are vessels that carry blood away from the heart. Veins are vessels that carry blood toward the heart. It doesn't have anything to do with how oxygen rich or oxygen poor the blood is. So this is why you should be careful when you're looking at illustrations or at models in the lab. Almost all of the arteries will appear red, and the veins will appear blue. But when you're looking at the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins, the colors will appear flipped. And that's because the pulmonary arteries are going away from the heart, A for away. So an artery carries blood away from the heart, but it has not yet reached the lungs, which is why it's oxygen poor blood. After it goes through the pulmonary circulation and picks up more oxygen, now it has oxygen rich blood, but since it's on its way back to the heart, it's carried in a vein. So, with the exception of the pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins, almost all of the arteries will appear red and the veins will appear blue. But be careful for that color difference if you're looking at illustrations or models with the pulmonary vessels. Those colors will appear as though they're flip-flopped. The heart is located in the middle of the chest. You can see it tips a little bit to the left-hand side. You have this kind of cardiac notch in the lungs that allows for that tip. You can see it sits right in the middle in between these two lungs. And here are some of the major vessels of the heart right here. On an anterior view of the heart, I want to point out a couple of things that are major landmarks and things that students traditionally mix up. You know that there are 4 main chambers in the heart. You've got 2 atria and 2 ventricles. It's very common to confuse an atrium with an auricle. So an atrium is one of the chambers on the inside of the heart. And you can see this auricle, this kind of flap that's on the exterior of the heart that sits on top of each atrium. So you can see the right auricle right here. It sits on top of the right atrium. And then you can see a little bit of the left auricle over here that sits over the left atrium. These terms are not synonymous, so just be careful and watch out for that. I also want to point out some of the major vessels of the heart. You can see the superior vena cava here and the inferior vena cava right here. Both of these will connect to the right atrium. So if you're exploring a real heart in a lab and the vessels are not color-coded like this, what you can do is examine with your finger or a probe and find where do these vessels lead. If the vessels lead into the right atrium, you know you found the vena cava. The one up here on top is going to be the superior vena cava, and the one on the bottom, the inferior vena cava. You can also clearly see the aorta right here. Here's your aortic arch right here. And you can see the 3 main branches that come off of the aorta. Your pulmonary artery extends from the right ventricle. So as the right ventricle pumps its blood, it's going to pump into this pulmonary trunk, which is an artery since you're moving away, and then that vessel will divide into your right and left pulmonary arteries, and each of those will go to the right and left lungs. Down here, you can see the great cardiac vein up here. It's going to extend up and it's going to extend around. I'll move to a posterior view. Here you have the great cardiac vein, and then as it enlarges, here is the coronary sinus. A lot of students mix up the great cardiac vein and the coronary sinus. This enlarged area is the coronary sinus, and it sits in a groove called the coronary sulcus. So the sulcus is the groove, and the sinus is the blood vessel. And then the great cardiac vein will lead into the coronary sinus. On the back, you can see a couple more of the major vessels. So again, here's your superior and inferior vena cava that drain into the right atrium. Here we have your pulmonary artery that we visited before that branches into your left and your right, heading to each of your lungs. Here's your aorta, and here are your pulmonary veins. You have two coming from each lung. So here's the two on the left, here's the two on the right, and all of these vessels will drain into the left atrium, heading back to the left side of the heart. Here is a section of the heart. One thing that I want to make sure to point out here is the difference in the thickness of the myocardium. You can see the right side over here has a relatively thin myocardium compared to the left side. You have a very nice thick myocardium on the left side, and this is because the left side has to pump with more force. It does not pump a greater stroke volume, but it does have to pump with more force. If you go back and think about which circuits each side pumps to, the right side pumps to the pulmonary circuit, and the lungs are only a short distance away. The left side, this ventricle, has to pump through the systemic circuit and pump blood all the way up to your head and all the way down to your toes and back to the heart again. So the left side has a really big job, and it has a thicker myocardium to help it. You can also see the valves very clearly here. You have two atrioventricular valves. So the AV stands for atrioventricular. And so that includes the tricuspid valve right here, your right AV valve or tricuspid valve. If you look at a real heart, you can see it has three cusps. And your left atrioventricular valve, also called your bicuspid valve, also called your mitral valve over here. And it just has two cusps, so that's why it has the bicuspid name. Each of these atrioventricular valves has a similar structure. It's connected to these chordae tendineae here, and here, and here, also on this side. Here's chordae tendineae. And these cords connect to papillary muscles. So here's papillary muscle here, and here, and here. So these are raised muscle fibers. These bundles are connected to the chordae tendineae. You'll also see other muscle bundles. So you can see in the back over here, up over here, and up over here. These are not papillary muscles, but instead called trabeculae carnii. And so these are the raised muscle bundles that are separate, that are not connected to the tendinous cord. So here's trabeculae carnii right here in the back, and then compared to papillary muscles that are actually connected to your chordae tendineae. In the atria, you have similar raised bundles, but they are called pectinate muscles right here. While we're in the right atrium, let's take a look at this fossa ovalis. This is a remnant from when the heart had an opening in between the right and left atria, allowing that atrial blood to mix between the right and the left sides of the heart. Before birth, the infant or the fetus is not using its lungs for oxygen. It uses the placenta. So there's no need to separate the right and the left sides of the heart. As we move on to other blood vessels, I want to encourage you to review the regional terms that you have learned in the beginning of AMP1. A lot of these regional terms are used to name blood vessels, and so if you're familiar with them, it will make learning your blood vessels a lot easier. So you can refer to the beginning of your textbook, or here are some pictures that you can refer to. So for example, this region of the arm is referred to as the brachial region. You have a brachial artery and brachial vein that run through this region. So that's just one example of how knowing your regional terms can help you remember your blood vessel names. Here's another similar picture. So as we look at some of these blood vessels, I want to make sure that you pay attention to how the blood vessel names change as you move through, as you follow blood vessel through the body. So when you start off with this branch right here, for example, you have your brachiocephalic trunk that branches off, and as you continue through here, this same blood vessel becomes a subclavian artery. Subclavian continues down into the armpit area to be named the axillary artery, and as you follow it down into the arm area, it is renamed the brachial artery, and then it will split down here into the radial and ulnar artery, and then finally down here into your superficial and deep palmar arches. But this is more or less the same blood vessel that you traced from the aorta, but as you move through the body, you have different names that it's called. So pay attention to what region of the body you're in so that you don't accidentally call it the wrong name. So in this thoracic view, you can clearly see the branches off of the aorta. Here's the brachiocephalic trunk. It is an artery as you are carrying blood away from the heart. The brachiocephalic trunk will branch into your right common carotid artery and then your right subclavian over here. But you can see on the left side, your left common carotid here and your left subclavian have their own individual branches off of the aortic arch. So it's just a little bit weird that you have the brachiocephalic trunk that gives rise to your right common carotid and your right subclavian, but your left common carotid and your left subclavian artery branch individually off of the aorta. So just remember that those right side branches come off of the brachiocephalic trunk. In this view, you can see a little bit more clearly how those blood vessels change names as you move down the arm. Any vessel that says circumflex is going to go around. So circumflex humeral artery, for example, goes around the humerus. You have a superior ulnar collateral artery right here that is kind of an extra side artery. It mirrors this ulnar artery that's down here, but you can see it is above the arrow. And sometimes it's useful to use these diagrams right here, helps you to trace the blood flow as it branches and then as these join back together. In this vessel, I want to show you how to help tell the difference between your internal and external carotid arteries, because students get these mixed up all the time. So starting from way down here, here's your brachiocephalic trunk coming off the aorta, and then you see that subclavian branch here. Here is your right common carotid artery. And as you come up here, you can see there's a fork in the road. It branches and you have your external carotid artery and an internal carotid artery. The internal carotid artery moves up toward the brain, so it's internal to your head. And then you have your external carotid artery, and that vessel will serve your face and more superficial areas. So internal carotid heads inside toward the brain. External carotid artery will serve your external head and face. Be very careful in your nomenclature when you are writing down answers and choosing answers. The common carotid and the internal carotid and the external carotid are all arteries. There are no carotid veins. And also watch the common and internal and external terminology. Usually you have a common artery and then that will branch into internal and external arteries. but there are a couple of exceptions. Here you can follow that internal carotid artery all the way into the brain. So this is an inferior view of the brain right here. You can see that internal carotid artery. And this circle on the inside right here is called the circle of Willis, or the cerebroarterial circle. And it just makes sure that even if you were to have a blood clot anywhere here, you're still going to be able to find other pathways in order to make sure that your brain has an excellent blood supply. So here's your anterior cerebral arteries right here. You've got a right and you have a left. You have an anterior communicating artery right here that communicates between those two vessels right here. And then your posterior communicating artery is right here, right here. And then here's your internal carotid artery again, right and left sides. As we move way down into the abdominal area, and we follow that aorta past down the diaphragm, so here's the aortic hiatus, so this is this opening in your diaphragm as that aorta descends down into the abdominal cavity. You see all of these branches coming off of the aorta, and there's several that you should be familiar with. This one right here that looks like a claw, and it has 3 branches, this is your celiac trunk. It has 3 vessels that come off of it. Moving down, you have a superior mesenteric artery. Here is a suprarenal artery, here and here. These big arteries right here heading to your kidneys are your renal arteries, right and left. As you head down, you see your gonadal arteries. So these would serve the ovaries or the testes. Here's right, and here's left. And then as you head down the aorta, here's another branch coming off of the anterior side, your inferior mesenteric. So here's superior, and then here's inferior mesenteric. And one good acronym that I like to use to help remember these branches is some chefs make some really good meatballs. So you have chef, C for celiac trunk, make, mesenteric, superior mesenteric, some, suprarenal, right and left, really, renal, R, good, gonadal, right and left, meatballs, M, inferior mesenteric, chefs, make, some, really, good, meatballs. And keep in mind that celiac trunk and your superior and inferior mesenteric come off the front of your aorta, and other than these branches, you don't have right and left, but you do have right and left suprarenals, right and left renals, right and left gonadals. So make sure to include your rights and lefts for those vessels. As we get to the bottom, you can see the bifurcation of the aorta, which is just a fancy word for split. So the aorta divides right here, and it becomes the right and left common iliac artery. So here's the right, and here is the left. The common iliac arteries, similar to the carotids, will branch. You have external iliac arteries that will continue down the leg, and then you have internal iliac arteries that come here. So on the left side, here's your internal iliac, and then down here is the external iliac. Above this branch, so right here, that would be the common iliac artery on the left side. Here you can see the branches of that celiac trunk a little more clearly. Here you have your common hepatic artery that's going to head up and serve your liver. In the middle right here, you have your splenic artery, which you can follow along the pancreas to the spleen. And then here you have the left gastric artery that will serve the stomach. Here is a great picture showing the difference between the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. This is a picture showing the distribution of the superior mesenteric artery. You can see it serves the small intestine as it continues to branch over here, and then it also serves a pretty good portion of the large intestine along the ascending and transverse colon. The inferior mesenteric artery, as we move down the aorta, serves a little bit of the transverse colon and then the descending colon and the rectum. Here's that bifurcation of the aorta where we just were, common iliac artery, and then you have your external and internal iliac arteries. The external iliac artery is going to continue down the leg, and as it comes along the femur, we're going to change its name to the femoral artery. So here's your right femoral artery. And again, just like the arm, you can see some of these branches. Here's the circumflex femoral artery going around that bone. You can see a branch coming off right here, the deep femoral artery. So the main femoral artery is going to be a little bit more medial, and the deep femoral artery will, of course, be deeper and also run a little bit more along the bone, be a little bit more lateral compared to the regular femoral artery. Down here you can see the descending branch of the lateral circumflex femoral artery. So here's your circumflex femoral artery, and this is just the descending branch of that artery. We're going to come back to this femoral artery and follow it down. As you continue down, as it crosses the knee, we're going to change its name to the popliteal artery. And you can see it's shaded right here because we're heading to the other side of the leg. It's more common on, here's a posterior view, so it moves to the posterior side of the leg. This popliteal artery is going to divide. The area that heads down along the back of the tibia is going to be the posterior tibial artery. You can see it more clearly in a posterior view right here. You have another split up here, which is the anterior tibial artery. So the artery that runs along the front is the anterior tibial artery, runs along the back is the posterior tibial artery, and then you have one more branch right here, and that's your fibular artery. We can see this a little bit more clearly from the posterior side. So again, here's your popliteal, and then as you follow it down, here's your posterior tibial, because we're looking at a posterior view. Here's your fibular artery, and then up here, this one that splits up higher, is your anterior tibial artery. And then as you continue to move down the leg, you've got medial, lateral, and deep plantar arches of the foot, similar to what you have in the hand. And here's your arcuate artery right there. For veins, we will be moving in the opposite direction. So veins are going to drain blood from your body in order to return it to the heart. Remember, arteries carry blood away, veins carry blood toward the heart. So you can see the main vessels that are going to carry blood toward the heart. You have the superior and inferior vena cava that will drain large portions of your blood. And then you have very similar sounding veins as arteries, depending on what region they're in, that will help drain that blood back toward the heart. With the veins, two of the main veins in the neck are going to be your jugular veins. You have an external jugular vein. You can see a little bit of it right here. And then you also have an internal jugular vein right here. The internal jugular veins and external jugular veins will both drain directly into the subclavian vein right here. They do not have a common jugular vein. So make sure you're not going to put common jugular vein for any answer choices. Here is your internal jugular vein right here and your external jugular vein here. They both connect directly to the subclavian vein right here. Subclavian, under the clavicle. And then subclavian will drain into superior vena cava. But if we follow the pathway of the blood a little bit farther out, you've got deep venous palmar arches and superficial venous palmar arches down here. And then there's two sets of veins as we head back up. So here's your basilic vein. As it lines up here, it's going to go along the medial side of your arm. Here's your basilic vein right here. And connect up here eventually to the axillary vein. On the lateral side, you have the cephalic vein, and it comes up here, and it won't connect until a little bit higher up once you get more toward the subclavian vein. Your brachial veins are up here. They'll drain from your radial and ulnar veins, and then they continue up here. Once you get toward the humerus area and the upper arm, they turn into brachial veins. And then they continue to drain. All of these veins will drain into the subclavian vein, collect blood from your internal and external jugular veins, and all drain back into your brachiocephalic veins. And then right and left brachiocephalic veins will both drain into your superior vena cava and deliver that blood back to the right atrium. As we look toward the hepatic systems, I want to make a note that portal systems are a little bit different. Normally, the pathway goes from the heart to an artery, and then smaller and smaller arteries branch into a capillary bed, and then you go into a venule and larger veins and back to the heart. Portal system have kind of a shortcut built in. They connect two capillary beds together, and they do that by using a portal vein. So be careful when you're studying the hepatic vein and the hepatic portal vein. They're not the same thing. So hepatic portal system is a common portal system. Also, the one connecting the hypothalamus and pituitary, the hypophyseal portal system. So here you can see hepatic veins in addition to the hepatic portal vein. So this large vessel back here, this is your inferior vena cava. This is draining from the legs. You've got your common iliac veins right and left down here. Here is your liver. Your hepatic veins are all of these little vessels right here. You can see the gastric vein here running along the stomach. It's going to be delivered here to the hepatic portal vein. So hepatic portal vein is right here. Normal, regular hepatic veins are up here. The hepatic portal vein wants to take all of the blood that you have delivered nutrients into from the digestive system and take it to the liver first before it has access to the rest of your body. So blood from the spleen. Here's your splenic vein right here, delivered to the hepatic portal vein. Gastric vein, blood from your stomach delivered to the hepatic portal vein. You have an inferior mesenteric vein right here and a superior mesenteric vein draining blood from your intestines. That also is going to be delivered to the hepatic portal vein. And so that blood is going to be run through the liver first before it gets sent back to the heart. So the first capillary bed is going to be over here with your digestive organs as those nutrients initially get into your blood. And then the portal vein will take them to the liver and its capillaries, and then from there you'll start to head back to the heart. Here are some of your hepatic veins right here. As you can see, they head right into the vena cava right here. And then as major branches off of your inferior vena cava, you've got your right and left renal veins. You have right and left suprarenal veins, and right and left gonadal veins. When you look at the left gonadal vein, it is actually a branch off of your left renal vein, interestingly. And then as you descend down here, well, rather as blood is being brought back up, it has blood fed into it from your common iliac vein. So just like in the arteries, you have right and left common iliac veins, and those get their blood from right and left external iliac and internal iliac veins. Make sure that when you are putting down your answer choices and you're writing out your responses, give the full complete name, which means you need to include right, left, you need to include words like internal, external, or common, and you need to include words like artery and vein. You have brachial arteries and brachial veins, internal and external iliac arteries and veins. So be careful not to mix them up and make sure you include all of the words to give a complete answer. So draining from the bottom, looking at the leg, here's a dorsal venous arch in your foot, and that drains into small saphenous vein heading up the lateral side of your calf area. The great saphenous vein heads up the medial side. So great saphenous is on the medial side, small saphenous is on the lateral side. And those drain all the way back here, ultimately back up toward your external iliac veins. In the middle, you have this anterior tibial vein that drains up here, becomes the popliteal vein. Lots of similarities with the arteries here. So here's the popliteal vein. It drains back up. Here's your deep femoral veins. You have a deep femoral vein just like deep femoral artery. It also is going to be closer to the bone, and it's going to be a little bit more lateral. Regular femoral vein is going to be medial. So here's femoral vein. We follow that back up, and it becomes the external iliac, internal iliac feeds into it to become the common iliac. So again, right above this branch, you've got external iliac vein here, internal iliac vein here, and when they branch and come together, that's where your common iliac vein will start. And then both right and left common iliac veins will feed into the inferior vena cava. So that's it for the overall blood vessels. If you are looking at the blood vessels microscopically in lab, we need to consider their anatomy microscopically. And in order to tell arteries and veins apart under the microscope, you need to examine their different layers. So all blood vessels have the same basic layers. You have a tunica intima or tunica interna. You have a tunica media and a tunica externa. Now, capillaries are only made of the tunica intima, but the other two vessels, arteries and arterioles, veins and venules, all other types of blood vessels except for capillaries have all three layers. So the arteries, their tunica intima, will be very similar to the veins, tunica intima. They both have an endothelial inside layer made of simple squamous epithelium. You see the subendothelial layer in both, although in arteries you have an internal elastic membrane. Because arteries are coming, they have the force of that left ventricle that's pushing blood through them, they need to have a little bit of stretch. So arteries will have an internal elastic membrane located on them, and that will be lacking on a vein. The tunica media in arteries will have quite a bit more smooth muscle here compared to a smaller layer of smooth muscle in the tunica media of veins. And you'll also see another elastic membrane. Here's the external elastic membrane right here, and that is lacking in the vein. Tunica externa will be a little bit thicker in veins compared to arteries, and this is the location of the vasa vasorum, which are the very tiny little blood vessels that serve your very large arteries and veins. So, in conclusion, much thicker, smooth muscle layer in arteries, much thinner in veins, and that will be one of your big clues. Another clue is to look at the size, the thickness overall of the wall compared to the lumen. If you compare wall thickness and lumen size, arteries have a very thick wall, mainly because of that smooth muscle, and a relatively, proportionately, smaller lumen compared to, if you look at veins, you have a smaller, thinner wall, but a much larger lumen. And because pressure is so low in the veins, you have valves, which you may or may not be able to see under the microscope. But you have these valves just in case blood pressure drops too low. Blood may fall back down, but it'll be collected in these valves and you won't have too much backflow. So look for larger lumens in veins, and because the thickness of the walls is so much less in veins, it will also may appear kind of oblong or kind of floppy looking compared to usually you'll see a more round appearance with arteries because they have a thicker wall that helps to hold them up. And again, capillaries only have a tunica intima. So you have this simple squamous epithelium, the endothelial cells, and the basement membrane. As you move away from the heart, you have very large vessels, and then they get smaller and smaller and smaller as you move away from the heart. You can see all the layers are still there, tunica intima, tunica media, tunica externa, but they just decrease in size. You get some adjustments. The elastic membrane starts to go away as you move farther and farther from the heart. Under the microscope, here's what an artery looks like versus a vein. You can see the artery is relatively round. It has a relatively thick wall. And then here's a vein. The wall is a lot thinner. It looks a little bit more oblong. It's not quite so round. And you can see some of the erythrocytes in the middle as well. For veins, here you can see on a close-up, this is the tunica externa over here. Here's the tunica media. You can recognize that smooth muscle. And then the tunica intima, remember, it's mainly going to be that single cell layer lining the lumen right here. And then you may see some adipose tissue and some other connective tissue on the outside over here. For arteries, here you have the external elastic lamina. It almost looks like a spring right here. Tunica externa is this whole layer right here. Here's all your smooth muscle, your nice big thick tunica media and smooth muscle, and then this is your internal elastic lamina. The tunica interna is pretty difficult to see, but this internal elastic lamina soaks up a lot of stain. A lot of people will confuse this for the tunica intima, so just be careful with that. This is the internal elastic lamina. You probably won't be able to clearly see the tunica interna. As you look at changes in the heart, because the infant is needing to breathe on its own after birth, and the fetus, while it's inside the womb, has the placenta to depend on for oxygen, there are several cardiovascular adjustments that are made at birth. For one thing, we discussed earlier, the foramen ovale turns into the fossa ovalis. So before birth, there's a small opening in between the right and left atria. The opening, the hole, is called the foramen ovale. And then as it closes after birth, you see this little remnant, this little indentation, and that's called the fossa ovalis. You also have a blood vessel called the ductus arteriosus, and it connects the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. And so you are redirecting blood that would go to the lungs, and instead it goes to the aorta and it's sent through the body instead. The lungs are not functioning yet before birth, so the fetus has very little need to send blood into the lungs because there's no oxygen there. So you have a blood vessel, the ductus arteriosus, that diverts that blood to the aorta instead. After birth, it's really important that you divert blood to the lungs so that you can get oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. So when it closes immediately after birth, it becomes the ligamentum arteriosum. It is going to take time for these structures to fully close, both the foramen ovale and the ductus arteriosus, so they won't fuse completely for a few months, but they will be significantly constricted right after birth. And then you have changes in the umbilical arteries. Those become the medium umbilical ligaments, and then the umbilical vein becomes a round ligament of the liver. So here's a picture of all that. So here's the fetus. Here's your ductus arteriosus that diverts blood from the pulmonary trunk and just sends that straight to the aorta. The foramen ovale right here allows blood to move between the right and the left atrium. Here is your umbilical vein that connects to the placenta and umbilical arteries. You have no need for those after birth, so they just turn into ligaments. And here's your umbilical arteries, and they turn into the median umbilical ligaments. You still see just a little bit of a remnant with that ductus arteriosus closes. Here's your ligamentum arteriosum, and then the remnant from the foramen ovale is now the fossa ovalis. And then if you look, depending on the model or illustration, you may be able to see that ligamentum arteriosum, that last remnant of what used to be the ductus arteriosus. Make sure that for your quiz and exam, you are familiar with all structures that are listed in your lab manual. Blood vessels, heart structures, whether it's on the model or images from your textbook, they're all fair game. A great way to practice is to get some unlabeled pictures or hide the labels from pictures. Take pictures of models in the lab and create your own PowerPoint or print out pictures and basically make a quiz for yourself. You can make a PowerPoint, you can put unlabeled pictures in sheet protectors and use dry erase markers to practice labeling over and over again. So there's a lot of different ways that you can study that aren't just staring at a picture over and over again. They'll be a little bit more fun and will also help get that information into your brain a little bit more clearly. Starting next lab period, we will be working on fetal pigs and pig hearts, and so we'll be looking at a lot of the same blood vessels, but you'll be able to see them in real specimen. If you have any questions during your lab prep, please make sure that you reach out to your instructor. We are huge A&P nerds and we love to answer your questions and love to help you find ways to remember these. So please reach out if you have any help or if you need any help, and happy studying.